Hello, welcome to Network Africa. Today on the program, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, urges improvement of humanitarian system as First World Humanitarian Summit continues in Turkey. Then a photographer documents lives of Burundi children refugees in a new artistic series. Later, the Vice President of Kenya confirms there's no going back in the decision to close Kenya's Dadaab refugee camp, the world's largest. Hello again, I am Amarachi Ubani. We begin with security matters right here in Nigeria. The army says the chief bomb maker of Boko Haram has been killed. A press statement issued by the acting director of Army Public Relations, Colonel Sani Usman, says a terrorist who was a high-ranking officer in the sect was killed while trying to flee from the Boko Haram camp. He says the Boko Haram insurgents suffered a major setback after another member of the sect got, quote, completely blinded when he was preparing an improvised explosive device. As you know by now, the first ever World Humanitarian Summit kicked off yesterday in the Turkish city of Istanbul, with United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urging governments and groups, private sectors and other stakeholders to take action to improve the global humanitarian system. In his opening speech at the two-day summit, Mr. Ban called on the participants to make concrete commitments in 5 areas: conflict prevention and resolution, strengthening the protection of civilians, leaving no one behind, ending humanitarian need and ensuring funding for humanitarian actions. He also called on all the parties to make efforts in halving the number of internally displaced people by 2030.
We created the World Humanitarian Summit in this unique and inclusive format because of the important role that people affected by crisis, civil society, NGOs, and others play in humanitarian action. Over the next 2 days, the people of the world are looking to us for commitment in 5 areas.
UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, renowned security and terrorism expert David Otto joins us from London. David, thank you for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you very much.
Let's begin with the chief bomb maker who was killed lately. How significant is this in the war on terror?
It's very important that the chief bomb maker, would have been killed by one of the...
We do apologize since we're having problems there with David's video and audio. I will get back to that interview as soon as we can. Now, when Burundi's political crisis broke out last year, over 250,000 people were forced to flee into neighboring countries. The crisis was sparked when President Pierre Nkurunziza pursued and later won a 3rd term in office, a move his opponents say violated the constitution and a peace deal that ended a civil war in 2005. Award-winning photographer Patrick Willock, has drawn inspiration from the unfortunate situation and has opted to produce a new series of images depicting the lives of refugee children.
In Nyarugusu camp in Tanzania, one of the largest refugee camps in the world, is home to some 80,000 Burundians. Over half of them are children. Many of these children have been left vulnerable to abuse, violence, exploitation, and separated from their families. Most of them can't bear to talk about what they witnessed or experienced. To highlight child refugees' experiences, British NGO Save the Children partnered with French photographer Patrick Willock to create a series of photographs that tell the stories of children living in refugee camps in Tanzania and Lebanon. His images aim to show the hopes, fears, and everyday challenges faced by Burundians seeking refuge in Tanzania. Rather than taking pictures of his subjects in refugee camps, he got the child refugees to act out their life stories.
It's been 5 days that we are here. We are now at Nyarugusu refugee camp working with the Burundian community. The art project is exactly the same as in Lebanon. We're basically working with children, listening to their stories, listening to their fears, to their hopes for the future, and turning this into reality, and having them act their own story into the sets that we're building.
He spent several months collaborating with communities, co-creating visual representations of stories and testimony told to him through workshops at Save the Children programs.
So the idea here was actually to play with children and within the camp. So I think we probably had something like 50 or 80 children that got involved in the process of this image by having each one of them, you know, symbolically put their hands, painted hands print on the sets behind me. So it's been quite a fun process, and I think the kids were really happy doing that.
With family structures broken and schooling interrupted, humanitarian workers say there is an urgent need to provide care and protection for the children and restore a sense of normalcy. The project is also part of a Save the Children campaign at the first ever World Humanitarian Summit currently holding in Turkey.
We've been able to reconnect with David Otto. He will be joining us via telephone from London. David, I'm glad we could get you back on the program. Thanks for staying with us. So let's begin with the chief bomb maker who was killed lately. How significant is this in the war on terror?
This is very significant, you know, depending on what point of view you have on this. The first thing is that, you know, we know that the chief bomber was killed because, possibly because, you know, he was trying to possibly leave Boko Haram or maybe his dissolution. You know, that actually gives us the impression that possibly there is an internal strife between the Boko Haram leaders, or maybe there is a disagreement on some of their strategies. So I think, you know, we have some kind of an understanding that, you know, this could be a very significant finding for counterterrorism. But however, we do know that, you know, leadership decapitation, you know, does not actually, you know, really do any significant damage to terrorist organizations, because, you know, in the long term, they'll simply just replace the leader.
Now, in truth, we've seen cases where killings like this have had a boomerang effect. And by that, I mean that a leader gets killed and a new leader who is often more ruthless replaces the deceased. Do you think this might be one of those cases?
There is a possibility, because if you look at, for instance, you know, the death of people like Bin Laden, you know, of Al-Qaeda, you know, even Mohammed Yusuf of the then Boko Haram in 2009, you know, it's actually led, you know, to more lethal leaders, you know, not just in Al-Qaeda. We now have ISIL, which is more deadly than Al-Qaeda. And in the case of Nigeria, we have Abubakar Shekaru, who is also more deadly than Mohammed Yusuf. So sometimes, you know, this could be a blessing in the sense that, you know, you must have decapitated, you know, one of their very significant members, but also it can actually lead to the emergence of a leader who is more lethal, and possibly, you know, somebody who is more talented, you know, than the person who's been killed. So it's a 50-50, but, you know, sometimes, you know, I believe that leadership decapitation doesn't actually do much in terms of counterterrorism strategy, you know, looking at groups like Boko Haram.
Let's take a look at the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. Nigerians have been troubled in the northeast, and they contribute largely to the current humanitarian crisis. How do you think Nigeria can benefit from the summit going on in Turkey?
This summit is the first of its kind, and I think, you know, looking at the situation in northern Nigeria, what you see is that, you know, there is kind of a focus, you know, on certain parts of the country, which is the north, you know, but, you know, I think it should be a global strategy. So it should not just be northern Nigeria, because we have other issues in the south, in the south-south, in the southeast, in northeast. So I think summits like this, you know, have to look at general issues addressing the core issues that lead to people becoming displaced in the first place, you know. They're not actually dealing with the consequences, because this kind of conferences that, you know, are being held, we've had thousands and thousands of conferences, you know, being held on behalf or for the sake of, you know, humanitarian reliefs. But, what we do not see is that most of these conferences do not actually bring in solutions, that actually touch on the communities that are more affected. So we do hope that, this first of its kind summit, to deal with humanitarian issues would actually make a difference on ground. But in as much as it does not deal with the motivation, the reasons why people become engaged in terrorism, in as much as it doesn't deal with the capability, how do people get weapons, how do they manage to acquire all these ammunitions, how do they actually manage to acquire logistics and intelligence. If you do not deal with those issues and you're looking at dealing with the effects or the consequences of those issues, then you are still not fighting the real crisis. So I think, it's just about, time, for us to stop, and then think and rethink.
Yeah. Agreed.
Strategies on dealing with these issues.
Agreed, David. Thank you so much for joining us in Network Africa. I appreciate your thoughts on the issues. When we come back after the break on Network Africa, the Vice President of Kenya says there's no going back in the decision to close the Dadaab refugee camp, known as the world's largest.